I still remember the taste of metal in my mouth the moment I saw it. His name. My stepfather's name. Sitting bold and brazen on my bank account paperwork, like it belonged there, like the bank had always recognized him as someone with rights to my money. The clerk looked at me with polite confusion while I reread the document again and again, convinced I had hallucinated the signature. But no, there it was. The man who had married my mother only 8 years ago had access. Legally. Fully. Without limits. To the account that held the last piece of my father's inheritance. The inheritance my mother had sworn, promised on her own mother's grave, would stay untouched until the day it was passed down to me. I felt something in my chest shift. Not anger yet. Not grief. Something colder. A slow, sinking sense that a betrayal had been unfolding quietly for years, and I had just now stumbled upon the final, polished chapter. I excused myself from the bank chair before I could start shaking in public. The clerk asked if something was wrong. I told her I needed a moment to think. To breathe. But inside me, a pressure was building. Not the frantic kind. The patient, sharpened sort. The kind that forms right before a truth is carved clean through a lie. Because I knew this wasn't a clerical mistake. My mother had done this. And she had done it deliberately. The question was, why? And what had they already taken? I walked out of the bank, clutching the papers in my hand, the winter air slicing across my face. A promise had been broken. And I wasn't even sure yet how deep the damage went. But I was going to find out, no matter what it cost. And that's when my phone buzzed, with a message from my mother. Just 7 words. Hope everything is going smoothly at the bank. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was a certainty. And now I understood. She was waiting. For what, I didn't yet know. But I was going to make her tell me. My name is Marianne Hale, and I am 62 years old. I don't rattle easily. Not anymore. Life does that to you. It sands off the edges, teaches you the difference between what's urgent and what's merely loud. I've known loss. I've lived through the slow crumbling of a marriage, the sudden death of a husband I loved more than I ever said out loud, and the long, quiet years of rebuilding myself when I thought I had nothing left to rebuild from. So I'm not naive, not fragile, not a woman easily fooled, which is why this betrayal, my own mother's betrayal, didn't land like a lightning strike. It landed like erosion, like something that had been happening grain by grain for years, and I just hadn't bothered to look closely enough. I grew up thinking my mother, Eleanor, was the kind of woman who operated on principles. She wasn't warm, but she was consistent. She wasn't affectionate, but she was fair. Or so I believed. When my father died 15 years ago, lung cancer, quick and devastating, I received a small inheritance from him. Nothing extravagant, but enough that he wanted me to have control over it. To use it for retirement, emergencies, something meaningful. Money he earned through honest work. And my mother promised me, then and many times after, that it was protected. My name only. My future only. I took her at her word. Because that's what you do with parents, even when you're far too old to be relying on childhood assumptions. But I suppose I underestimated how things can change when loneliness settles into someone's bones. When a new husband walks in. When control shifts hands in ways that are almost invisible, until suddenly they aren't invisible at all. My mother's third husband, Charles, never liked me much. I wasn't rude to him. I simply wasn't impressed. Something in his eyes always searched a bit too long. Not lecherous, calculating. You learn to recognize people who take inventory of a room and of you. So when I saw his name attached to my account, it didn't feel random. It felt like a plan that had been waiting for permission. Still, I didn't want to react recklessly. At 62, I don't do outbursts. I do clarity. But clarity comes from information. So that night, I sat at my kitchen table, spread out the paperwork, and realized something that made my stomach twist. The signature authorizing him looked exactly like my mother's handwriting, meaning she hadn't just known. She had initiated it. I wasn't angry yet, but I was getting there, and I could feel the cliff approaching, where one day soon, I'd have to confront her. My mother has always been a woman who respects structure. Schedules. Plans. Applause. She loved being seen as the strong one. The widow who remarried with grace, the pillar of neighborhood committees, the woman who sent holiday cards in July just to stay ahead of the calendar. Growing up, I was the opposite. Quiet. Observant. More interested in books than people. I didn't rebel. I simply didn't mirror her. And she never forgave me for that. Not openly. but subtly. In small criticisms, withheld compliments, tiny comparisons that stung more than they should have. Still, we had a functional relationship. A polite one. And after my father died, we tried to be closer. Grief makes unlikely companions of people who barely know how to say, "I miss you." Then she married Charles, a man with a smooth voice and a past that always felt half-told. My brother, Paul, warned me early on. He said something about their finances didn't add up, that Charles had been through 2 previous divorces, that he was too involved in decisions that weren't his to make. I shrugged it off. Mom was in her 70s. Let her have her happiness, I thought. But now, with his name grooming my inheritance like an uninvited fingerprint, I wondered how much I had ignored, and how much my mother had chosen to hide. Family is complicated like that. You spend decades convincing yourself of roles, the responsible mother, the loyal daughter, until one day you see those roles for what they really are. Stories you wrote because the truth felt too sharp. Our relationship was never warm, but it was predictable. What scared me now was realizing it might have been a performance all along. And performances require an audience. That meant there were layers I hadn't seen. I needed to know them all. Because if she had allowed Charles access to my inheritance, what else had she allowed him to touch? The lie unraveled faster than I expected. The next morning, I went directly to the bank and requested the full history of authorization changes on my account. 2 years ago. That's when it happened. Not recently. Not during an emergency. Not in a moment of confusion. 2 years ago, my mother and her husband had walked into that bank together and added him, without ever telling me. I stared at the date. 2 years ago, my mother had knee surgery. I remember visiting her, cooking for her, bringing her magazines. She had been so grateful. So sweet, even. And while I was busy taking care of her, she was giving Charles access to money that never belonged to him. The clerk looked uneasy when she printed the documents for me. She said, "They insisted it was for safety, in case something happened to you." I almost laughed. If something happened to me, why would he be the one choosing what became of my money? Why not my own brother? Why not my children? Because this wasn't about safety. This was about possession. About opportunity. About preparing for something they expected to benefit from. I left the bank with a pit in my stomach. Not because the money was gone. I didn't know that yet. But because the betrayal had taken root long before I ever suspected. My mother knew exactly what she was doing. And she had counted on me never checking. That's when the real fear started to rise. If they had claimed authority over the account, had they used it? Had the inheritance already been spent? I drove home trembling, the road blurring through my tears, the papers on the passenger seat whispering the truth I didn't want to face. By the time I reached my house, I wasn't trembling anymore. I was ready to investigate. That afternoon, I sat at my dining table with a cup of mint tea and began documenting every detail. Dates, signatures, bank statements, phone records. I asked the bank to send me the past 24 months of activity. I created a folder. I opened a spreadsheet. I became, quite suddenly, the version of myself I had been during my legal assistant years, methodical, calm, thorough. And what I found made my throat tighten. Not large withdrawals. Not dramatic transfers. Something worse. Small, regular siphoning. 200 here. 300 there. 1,000 once every few months. Amounts small enough to avoid suspicion. Amounts just under the threshold that would trigger bank alerts. Amounts totaling, in 2 years, $48,000. Nearly half of what my father left me. Every transaction labeled as something vague. Household expenses, medical supplies, joint maintenance. Except I didn't live with them. And I knew for a fact my mother had full medical coverage. I printed every transaction. Highlighted patterns. Marked dates that aligned with moments my mother told me she was tight on money or handling bills. It was theft. Quiet. Systemic. Calculated. But I didn't call them. Not yet. I needed more. I called a lawyer, someone who helped me with my will years ago. She recognized my voice, asked what was wrong in that gentle tone lawyers use when they know you're about to say something painful. I sent her everything. She reviewed the documents for 2 days. Then she called me back with a simple sentence. "Marianne, this wasn't an accident." She explained my legal standing. What was reversible? What wasn't? What constituted unauthorized access, even if technically permitted on paper? She ended with, "You need to talk to them, but not alone, and not without preparation." Preparation. I understood that word deeply. I wasn't going into a conversation. I was going into battle. And when I confronted them, I needed to ensure the truth couldn't slip through their fingers. So I gathered everything, documents, statements, timelines, and arranged them in a binder with tabs so clear even my mother couldn't pretend confusion. I was ready, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened when I finally walked into their house. My mother opened the door smiling. A soft, rehearsed smile. The kind she used at church or neighborhood brunches. The kind that didn't reach her eyes. Charles appeared behind her, wearing that same smug calm he always carried, as if every room belonged to him the moment he stepped inside. They invited me in. I declined. I wanted daylight, and witnesses if needed. I know about the account, I said. My mother's face changed, not shocked, not ashamed. Annoyed. Annoyed, as though I had interrupted a pleasant afternoon. Charles crossed his arms, already preparing to bulldoze the conversation. I opened the binder. Pages didn't shake in my hands. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I presented. Every highlighted transaction. Every inconsistent note. Every signature that should never have been written. My mother's jaw tightened. A flush crept into her cheeks. But she said nothing. Charles, however, stepped into the role he'd been waiting to play. He said they were protecting me. He said I wasn't managing my finances efficiently. He said it was family money anyway. Family money. My father didn't even like him. I looked at my mother and asked the only question that mattered. Did you know he was taking it? She hesitated. And in that pause, I heard my answer. Yes. Yes, she had known. Yes, she had allowed it. Yes, she had justified it to herself in whatever way people justify hurting their own children. But she couldn't say it aloud. Cowardice has a sound. Silence. I closed the binder. Told them calmly that my lawyer would be contacting them both. Explained that I had filed for account reversal, fraud review, and a civil claim. My mother gasped. Charles swore. But I didn't stay long enough to hear their protests. The turning point wasn't the confrontation. It was the moment I walked away without letting them rewrite the narrative. I finally understood. They weren't just wrong. They were willing to keep doing it until there was nothing left. And I wasn't going to allow that. The downfall wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cinematic in the way television makes justice look. It was slow, quiet, inescapable. First, the bank froze the account. Investigators reviewed the withdrawals. Signatures were compared. Patterns were established. Then came the official letters. My mother tried calling, first tearful, then furious, then pleading. I didn't answer. Everything went through my lawyer. Charles, meanwhile, began unraveling. His credit applications were denied. His access to my mother's finances was restricted by court order. His past debts resurfaced, hungry and loud. Eventually, the bank determined he had knowingly taken funds for non-authorized purposes, despite being listed on the account. They reversed the withdrawals. Every penny. With penalties. The total withdrawn became the total owed, to me. Which meant my mother had to face the humiliation of watching her husband be held accountable. Not by me, but by the very institutions he thought he could outsmart. Their marriage didn't survive it. Not really. Oh, they stayed under the same roof, but the rot set in quickly. Accusations. Cold dinners. Separate bedrooms. Neighbors whispering. My mother's pride, her most valued possession, fractured beyond repair. And Charles? He left town 6 months later. Not dramatically, not with a goodbye. Just gone. Poetic justice doesn't always look like revenge. Sometimes it looks like a man standing in the ruins he built with his own hands. The money returned to my account quietly, a digital whisper that appeared on a Tuesday morning. I stared at the balance for a long time, feeling nothing. Because the loss wasn't the money. It was the trust. I tried once to meet my mother for coffee. She looked smaller than I remembered. Older. Thinner. She kept stirring her cup even though she hadn't added anything to it. I never meant to hurt you, she said. And maybe she believed that. Maybe she told herself the story in a way that made her the victim of circumstance, of manipulation, of love misplaced. But I knew better. Harm doesn't require intention. It only requires permission. And she had given hers freely. I left the cafe without anger. Without reconciliation. Without revenge. Just clarity. Peace doesn't always come from forgiveness. Sometimes it comes from distance. The months that followed were quiet. Restful. I changed banks. Updated my will. Spent more time with my children and grandchildren. Breathed easier. The The wound closed not because she apologized, but because I finally saw her as she was, not as I needed her to be. And strangely, that truth set me free. If you've listened this far, here is the part one want you to remember. Betrayal rarely arrives suddenly. It grows quietly, beneath conversations, beneath assumptions, beneath the stories we tell ourselves about the people we love. And the most dangerous betrayal is the one hidden behind the word family. But justice doesn't require rage. It doesn't require revenge in the violent sense. It requires documentation, clarity, courage, and the willingness to stand alone if you must. My mother made her choices. So did I. And if you ever find yourself standing where I stood, wondering if you're overreacting, doubting your own instincts, questioning whether protecting yourself makes you disloyal, listen to the quiet voice inside you. The one that says, this isn't right. The one that says, you deserve honesty. The one that says, stop here. Investigate. You don't have to scream to fight back. You don't have to break anyone to protect what's yours. Sometimes the calmest voice in the room is the one that brings the truth into the light. And truth, once revealed, has a way of delivering its own justice.